Late in his 1855 memoir, My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass does something strange. He reprints a receipt, not a figure of speech, an actual bill of sale, copied out word for word. It reads, quote, "One Negro man by the name of Frederick Bailey or Douglass, to have and to hold the said Negro man for life," end quote. That is Douglass. Frederick Bailey was his birth name, and on the facing page, he prints the second document, the one that cancels the first, the paper that finally made him free. Here is what makes that strange. By the time those two papers were drawn up, Douglass had already freed himself. He had refused to be broken on a Maryland farm years earlier, and in 1838, he had boarded a train north out of Baltimore and taken his own liberty with his own nerve. So he was already gone, already living free in the North. And still, in the plain language of American law, he was a thing that could be bought and sold. It took strangers in England, passing a hat across an ocean, to buy him out of his own country. Now, we think we know this story. The abolitionists rescued him. The escape north was the happy ending, and that is where most tellings stop. But this book is not about the grateful freedman the movement liked to put on a stage. It is about a man who says something harder. He says the same friends who paid for his body also wanted to keep his voice. And he says the last thing he had to escape was not a slaveholder at all. It was the movement itself. He was out of slavery by 1838. So why does the end of this book read like a second escape? And who, this time, was he running from? Start with the rescue, because it was real, and Douglass never once pretends otherwise. In the summer of 1841, he was 3 years out of bondage, working in a brass foundry, and he went to an anti-slavery convention on the island of Nantucket, meaning only to sit and listen. A man named William Coffin had heard him talk in a New Bedford schoolhouse, and he asked Douglass to say a few words to the crowd. Douglass stood up shaking, and he spoke. And William Lloyd Garrison, the loudest voice in the whole anti-slavery movement, rose right after him and built his own speech on the young man standing there. That was the night the cause found its witness. Douglass was asked to become a paid lecturer, and it changed his life. And he says so with real gratitude. So far, this is the story we already know. What we tend to skip is the exact shape of the job he was handed. Watch how the man running the meeting put him in front of the crowd. He introduced Douglass as a piece of property, a thing, and told the audience in so many words that it could speak. It, not he. Now, that was theater. And it was good theater. It was built to shock a room full of white listeners into paying attention. And it worked. But it had a second edge. You can free a man and put him on display in the very same motion. And being the single most valuable exhibit in the room is not the same thing as being one of the people in it. So the comfortable version of the story is mostly true. Here is a man who freed himself, handed a national stage by people who were risking a great deal to hand it to him. The book just will not let us stop reading there, because the stage came with instructions. As Douglass traveled and spoke, the society's own agents kept steering him back toward one narrow job. Give us the facts, show the scars, leave the meaning to us. The general agent of the society, a man named John Collins, said it in a line Douglass never forgot. Collins told him, quote, "Give us the facts, we will take care of the philosophy," end quote. Read that as a division of labor. Douglass supplies the wound. The white organizers supply the argument about what the wound means. And the coaching got more specific than that and more revealing. One of them advised him, quote, "Better have a little of the plantation manner of speech than not. 'Tis not best that you seem too learned," end quote. In plain words, sound a little more like a slave and a little less like a thinker. Now, I want to be honest about that advice, because Douglas is. Was it condescension or was it strategy? There was a real argument underneath it. White audiences in 1842 flatly did not believe a polished, reasoning black man had ever been a slave. A raw, first-person story from a man who had clearly lived it was the single sharpest weapon the movement owned. Collins was not wrong that it worked, but Douglas had started reading and thinking, and he found he could not keep just narrating the wound when what he really wanted was to indict the people who had made it. He wanted to talk about the future, and they kept him pinned to the past. And so, very quietly, he made a decision. He would speak only the words that felt like his own to speak, not the ones handed to him. That one small decision is the hinge the whole rest of the book swings on. Then the pressure came from a corner no one expected. He got too good. Audiences started to doubt he had ever been enslaved at all. Too articulate, too educated. Surely a fraud the abolitionists had trained up and put on stage. And Douglas answered that doubt in the single most dangerous way open to him. He picked up a pen. He wrote the whole thing down, the names, the places, the dates, so that anyone who doubted him could go and check it. And in 1845, he published it as the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. That book cost him more than he expected. Remember, in the eyes of the law, he was still a runaway, still property, still hunted. And the book named names. His old master, Thomas Auld, Talbot County, Maryland, the ground he came from. It printed the whole map a slave catcher would need to find him. His friend, Wendell Phillips, read the manuscript, went pale with worry for him, and told him that if it were his, he would put it in the fire. So let me be fair to the movement here, because the lazy version of this story gets it backwards. They did not try to stop him. Once Douglas chose to publish, Phillips and Garrison put their own names in the opening pages, because a fugitive's testimony in print was good for the cause. The fear was for him. The support was real. So what set the writing apart from the speaking was not that they resisted it. It was what it did to him. The book that answered every doubt about him was the same book that told his old owner exactly where to look. To survive having written it, he had to leave the country that still claimed to own him and sail for England. Notice the pattern. The speaking, in a way, belonged to the movement. The writing was the first public act that was fully his own. So he crosses the Atlantic, and out of those 2 years abroad comes the receipt from the top of this episode. He lectured all over Britain and Ireland, and for the first time in his life, he was treated like a man among men, seated at tables that would have thrown him into the street back home. And his British friends could not stand the thought of shipping him home to a country where any slave catcher could grab him off the street. So they did the thing his allies back home found so troubling. They bought him. A group of British abolitionists, led by a woman Douglas names as Mrs. Henry Richardson, raised the money, and it sailed back across to Maryland. There, the papers got drawn up. His old master, Thomas Auld, signed him over to his brother Hugh, and Hugh, back in Baltimore, signed him free. Then the deed came back across the sea and into his hands. 150 pounds sterling for a man. That is the receipt he reprints in the book, the bill of sale for a living person and the slip of paper that voided it. Cold and legal and humiliating, and, he insists, worth every shilling. Here is why. Writing back in 1855, he credits that 1846 purchase with sparing him from a law that did not even exist yet when the purchase was made, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. When Congress passed that act 4 years later, Other free-living men were seized off northern streets and dragged back south into slavery. Douglas was safe from the catchers for one reason. Somebody, somewhere, held a receipt. And he refuses to be ashamed of it. He was not conceding that anyone ever had the right to own him. He was paying off a thief. Douglas writes, quote, "Viewing it simply in the light of a ransom or as money extorted by a robber, I could not see either a violation of the laws of morality." End quote. Said plainly, when a robber has a gun to your head, buying your life back is not the same as agreeing the robber was in the right. And this is the crack that opens the whole rest of the book. Some of his own anti-slavery friends were not glad he had been ransomed. To them, handing money to a slaveholder admitted something, on paper, that they had sworn was never true, that a human being could be property at all. It was a real principle, and it was held by serious people, but it had just landed its full weight on the single man it was supposed to protect. Douglas does not call them villains. He states their objection, and he grants that it was sincere. Then he lets you feel the cost of it. Here was a principle its holders would not bend, not even to keep a hunted man out of chains. Here is where the story we inherited quietly comes apart. The version we are handed ends about now, with the grateful freedman and the generous friends who bought his liberty. And it calls that the happy ending. Douglas does not. He turns the last stretch of this book into the record of a second escape. And this time, he is not running from a slaveholder. He is walking away from the people who did the most to lift him up. When he gets home, the crack widens into a break. And it is a quiet one, more a change of mind than a fight. His British friends had offered him a personal gift. He asked them instead for the money to buy a printing press because he wanted his own newspaper, run by a black man in black hands. And his Boston allies, the very people who had put him on the platform, were against it. They told him it was not needed. They told him his gift was the platform, not the printing press, that he belonged on a stage and not behind an editor's desk. And they warned him that every black-run paper anyone had tried in this country had folded, and that one more public failure would be worn by the whole cause. That was caution with hard evidence behind it. But listen to what keeps surfacing underneath the caution. Speak, do not write. Be the voice, not the author. He did it anyway. In 1847, he started his own paper, the North Star. And here is a detail that cuts both ways. He set the paper up not in Boston, but in Rochester, in western New York. And he tells us he did that not to spite his Boston friends, but, in his own phrase, from motives of peace, so that his paper would not pull readers away from Garrison's. So even as he walked out, he was still deferring to them. And then, over the next few years, came the thing he says he never saw coming. Running his own paper forced him to think one hard question all the way to the bottom for himself. And about 4 years on, he had changed his mind on the single doctrine at the dead center of Garrison's movement. Garrison held that the Constitution was a slaveholder's document, and that the free states should break up the Union to be rid of it. Douglas, arguing it out in his own pages week after week, came out the other side believing the opposite. He decided the Constitution could be turned into a weapon against slavery instead of a reason to run from it. To his oldest friends, that was not a disagreement. It was desertion. Douglas writes, quote, "The common punishment of apostates was mine," end quote. An apostate is someone who abandons the faith, and that is how they treated him, as a traitor to the cause. And then he tells us exactly what had loosened his mind enough to change it. Douglas writes, quote, "But for the responsibility of conducting a public journal, I should in all probability have remained as firm in my disunion views as any other disciple of William Lloyd Garrison." End quote. Read that slowly, because it is the whole answer. He is saying that if he had never run his own paper, he would have stayed a follower. The paper was what changed him. The moment he held one of his own, he stopped being a disciple. And notice what he did not do. He did not leave the fight against slavery. He left the one faction that wanted to decide how he fought it. So, going back to the question we started with, read the last chapters as a second escape, and the shape of the whole book shifts under your hands. Douglas never uses that phrase himself, but he hands you every piece of it. He broke away because the movement that had given him his platform still wanted to keep his voice. And he could not become the author of his own life until he stepped out of their script and took up the editor's pen his friends had begged him not to touch. Think about the three freedoms in this book. His own nerve had freed his body. His British friends had paid to make that freedom legal. But the last part, becoming the author instead of the exhibit, no one could do for him. He had to take it himself. And that is part of why this very book exists at all. My Bondage and My Freedom, published in 1855, is the second time he sat down to tell the story of his own life. And this time, the hand on the pen is his. Now, in fairness, we should turn the same doubt on Douglas that he turns on his friends, because he has earned that much scrutiny. This is his account, written years after the fact, by a man with every reason to make his break look like a clean awakening of conscience, rather than what it also became over the next several years, a public and bitter feud with the most famous white reformer in America. A memoir is a kind of authorship too. The man holding the pen is grading his own escape. So take his version as the truth it reaches for, and also as the case of an interested witness. What I keep landing on is smaller than a slogan. Being spoken for, even by people who love you and risk everything for you, is just not the same as speaking for yourself. But the harder part sits right beside that, and it is just as real. The abolitionists were not the villains, and this whole episode has tried to keep that in view. Their one purest principle, that you must never concede a man is property, is the same principle that left some of them unhappy he was ransomed, and turned his honest change of mind into apostasy. You start to wonder whether a good movement had confused obedience with loyalty, and could no longer tell a comrade from a convert. So here is what the book leaves in your hands. If Douglas is right, then a movement that lets the man it lifted up be only a witness and never an author has started, in its own gentler way, to keep for itself the very voice it set out to free. But if a cause lives or dies by its unity, then 100 people, each reasoning their own way to a new position, is not a stronger movement. It is a scattered one. And the discipline Douglas walked out on was the very thing that gave the cause its force. Where I come down most days is that the pen was worth the cost. But I can only say that from outside the movement he had to break to pick it up. And that view is cheap. The question he actually hands you and does not close is whether a cause can ever let the people it champions think for themselves and lead without calling it betrayal.